Hey guys, tonight the story of the crack cocaine epidemic is not a simple narrative of a drug appearing on the street. It is a complex chronicle of chemistry, class, capitalism, and crisis. To understand the thunderous devastation of crack in the mid-1980s, one must first appreciate the quiet, almost glamorous revolution that preceded it, the cocaine boom of the 1970s and early 1980s. During this time, the drug, in its powdered hydrochloride salt form, completed its decades-long journey from a legitimate medical anesthetic and a celebrated ingredient in early soft drinks to the ultimate status symbol of the American elite. The image of powdered cocaine was meticulously crafted and enthusiastically embraced by popular culture. In the me-decade, the drug was seen as the perfect pharmacological accompaniment to the pursuit of success. It was the white powder of power, a substance that promised boundless energy, heightened focus, and an intoxicating sense of superiority. Unlike the psychedelic and downbeat drugs of the counterculture era, cocaine was clean, capitalist, and chic. Hollywood portrayed it in movies, musicians sang about it, and Manhattan socialites openly shared lines at exclusive parties. It was a secret handshake among the successful, the unspoken proof that one had made it. The mythology held that cocaine was non-addictive, or at least only psychologically addictive, a lie that would soon prove catastrophically expensive for the entire nation. This social acceptance fueled an exponential increase in demand. The affluent and upwardly mobile were willing to pay premium prices, creating a massive, lucrative market. This demand, in turn, spurred the professionalization of the international drug trade. Colombian cartels, particularly the infamous Medellin organization, streamlined the supply chain, transforming illicit drug trafficking into a global logistical marvel. Cocaine flowed from the coca fields of the Andes through sophisticated smuggling routes into the major American port cities, particularly Miami, where a torrent of drug money warped the local economy and birthed a new era of opulent, reckless criminal wealth. By the early 1980s, this relentless efficiency achieved the disastrous market paradox. The supply of powdered cocaine had begun to outstrip the high-end demand. The market, once exclusive, was becoming saturated. As happens in any oversupplied market, prices began to fall. The cartels and major distributors, unwilling to see their revenue shrink, needed an innovation, a way to move a colossal, overabundant product to a broader consumer base. This necessity, coupled with a simple chemical principle, set the stage for one of the most destructive pharmacological transformations in modern history. The key to crack's emergence lies in understanding the difference between two forms of the same psychoactive molecule, cocaine hydrochloride, powder cocaine, and cocaine base, crack or freebase. Powder cocaine, the hydrochloride salt, is water-soluble. This property makes it ideal for snorting, where it is absorbed through the nasal membranes, or intravenous injection. However, heating cocaine hydrochloride to a point where its vapors can be inhaled requires extremely high temperatures, which often destroy the drug's potency. Furthermore, the smoke is harsh, unpleasant, and inefficient. To be effectively smoked, the cocaine molecule needed to be chemically freed from its salt form. This smoking method, known as freebasing, was not new. It had existed for years as a dangerous process used by a small number of dedicated users. The original freebasing method was complex and notoriously perilous, involving mixing the powder with highly volatile and flammable chemicals like ether to separate the cocaine base. The infamous 1980 accidental death of comedian Richard Pryor, who severely burned himself while attempting to freebase, highlighted the extreme danger of this process. It was expensive, complicated, and too hazardous for mass consumption. The genius and the horror of the eventual crack formula was its simplicity. Street chemists, likely drawing on knowledge of the original freebase technique, discovered that by mixing powdered cocaine with ordinary inexpensive baking soda and water, and then heating the solution, they could effectively cook off the hydrochloride molecule. The resulting substance was a solid, off-white residue, the cocaine base, which would separate from the water. Once dried and broken into small, irregular rocks, this was the drug that became known as crack, a name derived from the distinctive popping or crackling sound it makes when heated for smoking. The change was revolutionary. Elimination of danger. The process was now safe, eliminating the need for volatile solvents like ether. Accessibility. The necessary ingredients, baking soda and a stove, were cheap and universally available. Affordability. This was the crucial difference. Powder cocaine was sold by the gram, costing upwards of $100 in the early 80s. Crack could be broken down into tiny, user-ready rocks and sold for as little as $5 or $10. This transformed the market overnight. The drug that was once exclusive for Wall Street brokers was now affordable to the long-term unemployed. The chemical change to cocaine base wasn't just a marketing innovation, it was a pharmacological weapon. When crack is smoked, the vaporized cocaine base is inhaled directly into the lungs, where a massive dose is absorbed directly into the bloodstream in a matter of seconds. This blood is then pumped straight to the brain, producing an instantaneous, intense, overwhelming euphoric rush known as the bell ringer. This intensity stands in stark contrast to snorting powder cocaine, where the drug is absorbed slowly through the mucous membranes, leading to a much milder, gradual high. The smoking of crack delivered a level of physical and psychological pleasure that few had ever experienced, bypassing the brain's natural reward system with brutal efficiency. However, this spectacular high was tragically short-lived, lasting only between 5 and 10 minutes. The user crashed just as quickly as they peaked, experiencing a debilitating descent into severe paranoia, anxiety, and deep depression. The sheer intensity of the crash created an immediate, overwhelming compulsion to repeat the dose. This made crack exponentially more addictive than powder cocaine. Users would consume a drug relentlessly, often for days, in a desperate attempt to chase the initial, unattainable euphoria. This destructive cycle was a driller's dream, a product that guaranteed rapid, frantic, and repeated consumption.
The arrival of the $5 rock coincided with the final, brutal collapse of the industrial economy in America's inner cities. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, a structural economic shift had gutted urban areas. Manufacturing jobs disappeared overseas or moved to the suburbs. Systemic racism in employment and housing ensured that predominantly black and low-income communities were hit the hardest. These neighborhoods were simultaneously suffering from reduced social services, neglected public schools, and a profound sense of abandonment. In this context of pervasive despair and lack of legitimate employment opportunity, the crack trade offered a perverse form of economic salvation. With little need for startup capital beyond the initial powder and baking soda, and a guaranteed high-demand product, crack dealing became a viable, if violent, path to quick wealth for disenfranchised youth. The economics were simple and brutal. A kilogram of powder cocaine that might have fetched $50,000 to $60,000 when sold wholesale to a distributor could be cooked into crack rocks and sold on the street for up to $200,000, creating an irresistible profit margin. The drug moved from the streets of Miami, New York, and Los Angeles and radiated outward with terrifying speed, fueled by both the market necessity of the suppliers and the profound hopelessness of the consumers. The powdered cocaine that had once symbolized the reckless excess of the upper class had been chemically democratized, transformed into an instrument of self-destruction and community ruin for the nation's most marginalized populations. The glamorous status symbol had become the engine of a public health and criminal justice catastrophe. The groundwork was laid for a decade of unparalleled social devastation, a crisis born in the lab and weaponized by economic desperation. The stage was set for the war on drugs and the era of mass incarceration that followed. The explosion of crack cocaine in the mid-1980s was not a random event. It was a crisis born from the convergence of a hyper-addictive product and a pre-existing social disaster. The urban landscape of the early 1980s was a powder keg, a densely populated, economically devastated region waiting for a spark. To understand this fertile ground, one must first trace the economic violence inflicted upon America's inner cities in the decades leading up to the crisis. Beginning in the 1960s and accelerating through the 1970s, the heartlands of American industry, the major manufacturing centers of the Northeast and Midwest, experienced a massive, irreversible process known as deindustrialization. Traditional industries like steel, automotive manufacturing, textiles, and shipping, which had long provided stable, unionized, and dignified employment for millions of working-class Americans, vanished. Factories closed down, jobs were shipped overseas, and corporate investment shifted to suburban areas or the developing world. Crucially, The people left behind in the inner cities were disproportionately African Americans, who had migrated north during the Great Migration seeking opportunity, only to be systematically blocked from achieving wealth by decades of racial discrimination. Policies like redlining had confined these communities to specific, often dilapidated urban areas. When the factories closed, the damage was localized and catastrophic. A job at a local steel mill or auto plant, which once provided a path to home ownership and middle-class stability without the need for a college education, simply ceased to exist. This sudden, profound job loss led to a collapse in the social economy. Entire blocks, once vibrant with working families, fell into disrepair. Tax bases evaporated, leading to the rapid decay of public infrastructure. Schools deteriorated, police presence dwindled, and recreation centers closed. The social contract was broken. For a generation of young men and women in these neighborhoods, the conventional pathways to success, education, work, and military service, had either been destroyed or become inaccessible. Legitimate opportunity was replaced by pervasive, systemic despair. The void created by the loss of the factory was perfectly sized to be filled by the arrival of the $5 crack rock. Deindustrialization was compounded by the phenomenon of concentrated poverty. As black middle-class families utilized new legal freedoms to move to the suburbs, a process known as black flight, they left behind valuable social capital, community leadership, and financial resources. This left behind the most vulnerable residents, whose poverty became geographically concentrated and socially isolated. Sociologist William Julius Wilson famously described this as the rise of the truly disadvantaged, people living in areas defined by joblessness, failing institutions, and profound social isolation. By the early 1980s, the inner city was less a neighborhood and more an abandoned territory. Residents were cut off from burgeoning suburban job markets by inadequate public transit and outright discrimination. Moreover, the lack of local employment meant that even legal economic transactions, the corner grocery store, the local bank, began to dry up, replaced only by pawn shops and check-cashing services. In this environment, an entirely new economy, the underground economy, took root. For young people facing a 50% or higher unemployment rate, the decision to engage in illicit trade was often one of grim logic, not moral failure. It offered immediate, substantial income, agency, and a perverse sense of success in a society that had otherwise rendered them invisible and superfluous. Powdered cocaine, expensive and requiring large-scale organization, had already created the initial drug distribution networks. The chemical simplification of crack made these networks explosively accessible to the very bottom of the economic ladder. Systemic poverty, particularly in this concentrated form, did more than just eliminate jobs. It eroded social capital. This is the network of relationships, shared values, and mutual trust that allows a community to function effectively. Before the crisis, communities often relied on the old heads, the elders, church leaders, and working-class veterans to instill values and maintain order. The crack era demolished this infrastructure. The intense, rapid addiction associated with crack undermined trust in ways that heroin or alcohol abuse had not. Family members became unreliable. Mothers neglected children. Neighbors betrayed each other for a $10 rock. The traditional mechanisms of informal social control, the stern glance from an elder, the collective shame felt by the neighborhood, dissolved under the solvent of relentless craving. Moreover, the crack economy offered an irresistible counter-narrative to the American dream. The young man on the corner, driving a luxury car and wearing expensive jewelry, represented a visible, immediate success that the local school teacher or social worker could no longer offer. This shift in local power dynamics alienated youth from traditional authority figures, drawing them into a hyper-violent, short-term vision of wealth. The system itself also played a critical role in compounding the crisis. President Ronald Reagan's administration, adhering to a philosophy of fiscal conservatism, championed deep cuts to social programs designed to help these communities. Housing. Cuts to public housing programs led to further deterioration of living conditions. Mental health. The closure of public mental hospitals left many individuals with severe mental health issues homeless and untreated, making them vulnerable to drug use. Job training and education, reduced funding for youth programs and vocational training further ensured that the legal path out of poverty remained barricaded. The message to the inner city was clear: you are on your own. This abandonment was the final, critical element that turned economic decline into a social catastrophe. Crack did not spread evenly across America. It first took root in the specific geographical hubs that were the epicenters of both the drug trade and concentrated poverty. Miami, Florida, as the primary gateway for cocaine smuggling from the Caribbean and South America, Miami was the initial site of oversupply. The first known cases of widespread crack use often trace back to the city's poorest neighborhoods, where a network of immigrant and African American dealers capitalized on the product innovation. Los Angeles, California. Specifically, the neighborhoods of South Central LA were ravaged by deindustrialization and the rise of gang culture. The Bloods and Crips, originally turf-based fighting groups, quickly became hyper-profitable crack distribution organizations, turning neighborhood streets into violent economic battlegrounds. New York City, New York. In the forgotten corners of Brooklyn and the Bronx, crack houses, abandoned buildings used for cooking and selling crack, became commonplace. The density of the population and the deep cuts to municipal services ensured the crisis spread like wildfire across the public housing projects. In each of these cities, the story was the same. The excess supply of a powerful new form of cocaine met an environment devoid of legitimate economic hope and saturated with social despair. The powder keg of poverty was primed by economic abandonment, and the simple chemistry of turning cocaine salt into cocaine base provided the fatal spark.
The urban landscape of the early 1980s was therefore a tragic tapestry, woven from decades of failed policy and systemic racism. It was a failure of national priority that preceded the drug itself. The epidemic was not a sudden, unpredictable wave of immorality. It was the inevitable consequence of a system that first stripped communities of their economic foundation and then failed to provide a safety net. When the crisis inevitably erupted, the political and public response would ignore this systemic reality. Instead of addressing the root causes, deindustrialization, concentrated poverty, and the abandonment of the inner city, the nation would focus exclusively on the symptom, the drug and the dealer. This narrative shift set the stage for the most destructive policy response of the crisis, the war on drugs and the subsequent era of mass incarceration, which cemented the destruction of the very communities that had been victimized by the economic forces preceding the crack epidemic. The powder keg had exploded, and the state's reaction would ensure the ruins remained for decades to come. The early 1980s presented the major drug cartels and American distributors with a problem that most legitimate businesses would envy: oversupply. The success of the glamorous cocaine boom had been too effective. The Colombian drug networks, flush with cash and operating with industrial efficiency, were importing massive quantities of powdered cocaine or cocaine hydrochloride into the United States. Demand among the affluent, while steady, could not absorb the glut. Prices at the wholesale level began to decline, threatening the gargantuan profit margins that sustained the trafficking empires. The challenge was clear: how to turn a luxury commodity into a mass-market product. The solution lay not in finding new high-income users, but in finding a way to sell the excess product in smaller, more numerous units to an entirely new demographic. This demographic was comprised of the same marginalized, economically abandoned communities discussed previously, the very people who had been priced out of the powder cocaine market. The existing powder model was a high barrier to entry business. A gram of powder cocaine might cost a distributor $100 to $150 in the early 1980s, a prohibitive price for someone scraping by on welfare or facing unemployment. The solution that emerged, the simple, ingenious transformation of powder cocaine into crack cocaine, was at its core a brilliant piece of predatory marketing and street chemistry. The $5 rock, an icon of the crisis, became the ultimate financial innovation of the illicit drug trade.
The move from powdered cocaine to crack cocaine dramatically lowered three key economic barriers. The most impactful change was in affordability. The process of converting powder to crack, as detailed in the previous section, mixing the powder with baking soda and water and heating it, allowed dealers to break down a single gram of powder into multiple small, smokable rocks or nuggets. While a gram of powder might sell for $100, that same gram, converted to cocaine base, could be divided into 10 to 20 individual rocks, each selling for $5 to $10. 1 gram powder, $100, to 10 to 20 rocks, $5 to $10 each. This small unit size meant that the drug was instantly accessible to individuals with almost no disposable income. A person could quickly acquire the necessary funds for a single hit by panhandling, petty theft, or selling a piece of property. This financial accessibility turned cocaine, previously associated with exclusive penthouses and nightclubs, into a common street commodity, easily purchased and consumed in the most impoverished neighborhoods. For distributors and small-time street sellers, the profitability was staggering. A kilogram of powdered cocaine might be purchased wholesale for $30,000. When converted to crack, that same kilogram could yield a street retail value of over $150,000 to $200,000. This conversion multiplier represented a profit potential far exceeding that of heroin or powder cocaine distribution. This vast profit margin created an irresistible incentive for young men and women in inner cities who possessed neither education nor legitimate job prospects. The barriers to entry for selling crack were low. Knowledge of the simple cooking process, minimal starting capital, and a willingness to operate in a hyper-violent environment. For a generation locked out of the conventional economy, the crack trade was framed as the only viable path to immediate tangible wealth, creating an endless supply of eager, often juvenile distributors. The final economic factor was the drug's short-lived, intense high. As discussed, the immediate, overwhelming rush of crack was quickly followed by a debilitating crash and intense craving. This meant that the drug had an extraordinarily high velocity of consumption. Powder cocaine users might take several hours or days to consume a gram. A crack user could smoke through an equivalent amount in minutes or hours, driven by the intense compulsion to chase the vanishing euphoria. This accelerated consumption cycle meant rapid repeat business for dealers, transforming the rate of cash flow in the underground economy. The customer was not only accessible, but also instantly converted into a high-frequency, desperate consumer. The mechanics of crack sales required a new retail model, giving rise to the notorious crack house. These were often abandoned, dilapidated buildings or apartments that served as both a processing center and a consumption site. The crack house optimized the sales process by offering a one-stop shop model. 1. Manufacturing. It housed the crude kitchen where the baking soda conversion was performed. 2. Retail. It offered a secure or at least guarded space for the transaction. 3. Consumption. Crucially, it provided a site for immediate use. Since the high was so short-lived, users could buy a rock, smoke it on the premises, experience the crash, and be instantly ready to purchase another, ensuring the dealer maintained control over the entire transaction cycle. The crack house became a nexus of crime, addiction, and violence, fundamentally altering the urban social landscape. Unlike previous drug markets that were often hidden, the crack trade established a visible, physical presence in the community, broadcasting the breakdown of social order and drawing in users from outside the immediate area, further straining neighborhood stability. The immense profitability and the low barrier to entry for dealers had an immediate, devastating effect on crime, the militarization of the street corner. The traditional organized hierarchy of drug distribution was fractured. While major cartels still controlled the flow of the powder, the retail crack trade was decentralized and fiercely competitive. Thousands of small-time dealers, often teenagers, were now competing for the same limited pool of consumers in high-density urban areas. Because there was no legal recourse and profits were so high, economic competition quickly devolved into extreme violence. Dealers formed or joined gangs to protect their turf, their specific street corner or housing project that served as their personal retail monopoly. The struggle for these economic boundaries fueled the widespread use of firearms and the dramatic spike in urban homicide rates throughout the mid-1980s. The violence was an extension of capitalist competition in an unregulated, abandoned market. The street corner became a literal economic battlefield where control of the $5 rock determined life or death. The genius of the $5 rock was its toxic inclusivity. Powder cocaine had respected class boundaries. Crack obliterated them. While crack disproportionately affected low-income minority communities, the areas with the highest rates of joblessness and concentrated poverty, its chemical intensity and low price also drew in people from all walks of life who had otherwise been marginal users or occasional experimenters. The addiction was so fast, so powerful, and so financially demanding that it quickly stripped away a user's resources, pulling people from all socioeconomic backgrounds into the same devastating economic and criminal orbit. Yet critically, the narrative surrounding crack remained entirely focused on the inner-city minority user. This media and political framing would prove essential in shaping the discriminatory policy response. When the affluent used powder cocaine, it was viewed as a private health failure. When the poor used crack, it was framed as a public criminal emergency requiring mass punitive action. The $5 rock, therefore, did not just revolutionize street economics, it cemented a deeply racialized perception of drug use and criminality that would soon be codified into federal law. The birth of the $5 rock was the ultimate collision of market forces and social injustice. It was the product that successfully converted the desperation of the economically abandoned into a massive revenue stream for transnational crime, simultaneously guaranteeing the internal destruction of the very communities that had been victimized by the economic forces preceding the crack epidemic.
The prior economic and chemical sections detailed how crack cocaine was perfectly engineered for mass consumption. This section must now confront the agonizing consequence of that engineering, the devastating human cost. When crack hit America's impoverished cities, it didn't just introduce a new drug, it introduced a terrifying new speed of addiction. Powder cocaine, snorted intranasally, took minutes to produce a high, allowing for some measure of control or at least spacing between uses. Crack cocaine, inhaled directly as a base, delivered a near instantaneous explosive rush to the brain, followed by an equally rapid and severe crash. This sudden, overwhelming pharmacological experience created a compulsion that was almost impossible to resist. Users quickly progressed from casual experimentation to complete dependency, often within weeks, sometimes after just a few exposures. The hallmark of the crack epidemic was the binge crash cycle. Users would engage in prolonged, frenzied binges, spending every last resource, money, possessions, dignity, to secure the next hit. When the drugs ran out, they were left in a state of crippling dysphoria, paranoia, and psychological torment. This torment created an almost singular focus: obtaining more crack. The drug's short duration and intense craving effectively eliminated the concept of the recreational user, turning almost everyone who touched it into a rapid addict. This accelerated addiction model fundamentally distinguished the crack crisis from the heroin epidemics that preceded it. Heroin addiction, while devastating, often allowed for a slower onset and a more ritualized, though still destructive, daily routine. Crack addiction was manic, financially ruinous, and often pushed users into extreme and immediate desperation, leading to petty theft, prostitution, and violent crime just to fund the next short-lived escape from the ensuing crash. It consumed not just individuals, but entire family economies, operating at a psychological velocity that few social support systems were prepared to handle. Perhaps the most tragic and indelible legacy of the crack epidemic was the complete collapse of the traditional family structure in the most affected urban neighborhoods. When a parent, particularly a mother, fell victim to crack addiction, the consequences for the children were immediate and profound. Mothers, traditionally the linchpins of community and domestic stability, found their focus entirely diverted by the drug. Child care, feeding, safety, and emotional needs became secondary to the desperate pursuit of the next rock.
This neglect often led to children being left alone, forced to fend for themselves, or, in the best-case scenario, being raised by overburdened grandmothers, aunts, or other extended kinship networks, the true, unsung heroes of the epidemic. The sheer scale of this family destruction overwhelmed already strained social services. The foster care system reached a breaking point, overflowing with children removed from homes deemed unsafe due to the parents' addiction. This created a generation of crack orphans, children who, through no fault of their own, faced a chaotic childhood marked by instability and the trauma of separation. Central to the national panic surrounding the epidemic was the concept of the crack baby. In the late 1980s, media and some researchers sensationalized the idea that children born to mothers who used crack cocaine during pregnancy were a lost generation, permanently, irreversibly damaged with severe neurological and behavioral deficits. This narrative often predicted these children would be incapable of learning, empathy, or functioning in society, destined only for a life of institutionalization or crime. This concept was largely a myth, built on shaky science and fueled by a profound racial and moral panic. While prenatal exposure to any drug, including alcohol, fetal alcohol syndrome, is harmful, subsequent robust research demonstrated that the damage attributed solely to crack cocaine was often exaggerated and critically indistinguishable from the damage caused by other environmental factors. Poverty. The children of crack users almost universally lived in conditions of extreme poverty, poor nutrition, lack of adequate prenatal care, chronic stress, and exposure to violence. These factors, known as environmental adversity, were far more detrimental to long-term development than the direct pharmacological exposure. The power of environment. Follow-up studies showed that children born with prenatal crack exposure, when placed in stable, nurturing environments, like those provided by their grandparents or foster families, often showed developmental and cognitive progress comparable to their peers. Policy implications. The myth was devastating because it provided an easy, genetic deterministic explanation for the crisis, allowing politicians to blame the victims and justify a punitive policy response. It implied that this was a crisis of individual failure and biological damage, rather than one rooted in systemic economic abandonment and policy neglect. It helped rationalize disinvestment in treatment and social welfare, substituting it instead with increased policing and incarceration. The epidemic systematically corroded the foundational social capital of the inner city, replacing trust with suspicion and communal support with competition for survival. 1. The rise of the insider-outsider threat. Dealers were often young people from the community itself, forcing residents to view their own neighbors and often their own children as both victims and predators. The crack house, though an economic hub, was also a center of blight, noise, and constant threat, forcing law-abiding families to live in perpetual fear. 2. The economy of distrust. As addiction intensified, so did the need for money. Users stole from their families and neighbors, radios, televisions, jewelry, anything to trade for a rock. This constant petty betrayal shattered the network of mutual reliance that had previously allowed these cash-poor communities to survive. Trust, the most valuable currency in a poor neighborhood, became extinct. 3. Loss of role models. The success of the young gun-toting dealer, flashy cars, expensive clothes, easy money, provided a visible, immediate, and irresistible counter-narrative to the patient, long-term ethos of the working poor. The drug dealer became the most visible, successful figure in many neighborhoods, fundamentally destabilizing the authority of teachers, pastors, and working parents. The result was a profound social tragedy. The very people who had resisted the economic collapse and maintained the social fabric of the ghetto were left to confront a crisis that turned their own friends and family members into unpredictable agents of destruction. IV. The shift from public health to public enemy. The human cost of the crack epidemic demanded a compassionate public health response. Mass treatment centers, funded social services, and economic revitalization. Instead, the scale of the destruction, sensationalized by the media and politicized by policymakers, solidified the narrative that the crisis was fundamentally a problem of crime and moral decay rather than a disease of despair. The sheer visibility of crack violence and the spectacle of addicted mothers in the courts generated immense public fear. This fear was weaponized, paving the way for the government to bypass addressing the systemic roots of the problem, poverty, joblessness, and instead focus on a simpler, more punitive solution, building prisons. The human devastation of addiction and family collapse was quickly translated into statistics on arrests, homicides, and incarceration rates. The individual struggling with a chemical compulsion was recast as a public enemy, and the neighborhood struggling for survival was marked as a territory under siege. The stage was now set for the federal government's catastrophic legislative response, the drastic sentencing disparities that would define the next 2 decades of American criminal justice.
The story of the street-level drug kingpins is inseparable from the power structure that undergirded the entire cocaine trade, the Colombian drug cartels. These organizations, primarily the Medellin and Cali cartels, were the true sovereigns of the supply chain. While they did not invent or retail crack cocaine, their immense success and logistical prowess created the market glut that necessitated crack's existence. By the early 1980s, the cartels had perfected the art of transnational smuggling, moving metric tons of powdered cocaine from the coca fields of the Andes to the coastlines of Florida and California. They operated with the efficiency of Fortune 500 companies, controlling everything from cultivation and processing to transport and wholesale distribution within the United States. Figures like Pablo Escobar and the Ochoa brothers were not merely criminals, they were economic titans whose wealth rivaled that of small nations. The cartels, however, preferred to remain several steps removed from the violence of the retail market. Their business model was to sell massive quantities of powder cocaine at the wholesale level to American distributors, often Cuban, Mexican, or Italian-American syndicates. These distributors, in turn, moved the product down to the mid-level dealers, who ultimately provided the raw product, the powder, to the street gangs who would perform the final, lucrative transformation into crack. The cartels supplied the gunpowder, the street gangs lit the fuse. The chemical and economic innovation of the $5 crack rock created a new class of entrepreneur, the street kingpin. Unlike the old-school mobsters or even the established heroin dealers, the crack kingpins were often young, hyper-aggressive, and highly visible. They rose to power not through quiet connections, but through audacious ruthlessness, transforming abandoned urban neighborhoods into personal economic fiefdoms. These kingpins operated on a scale previously unknown in the inner-city drug trade. They were the primary beneficiaries of the conversion multiplier, turning modest quantities of powder into immense retail profits. They pioneered vertical integration in the local drug economy, controlling the cooking of the powder, managing the retail sales, often through crack houses, employing distributors or runners, lookouts, security or enforcers, and maintaining a localized security force, the street gang. In Los Angeles, names like Freeway Rick Ross built vast, intricate empires that funneled cocaine into the communities of South Central LA. In New York, figures like Larry Davis, the Black P. Diddy, and others became notorious for their wealth and violence. Their success, often achieved in their late teens or early 20s, provided a devastatingly visible, immediate counterpoint to the decades of systemic economic failure. The conspicuous display of wealth, gold chains, luxury cars, expensive sneakers, served as a potent, mesmerizing magnet for youth trapped in poverty. This visibility, however, also guaranteed an equally visible, violent end. The core of the crack kingpin's power lay in their reliance on and elevation of the existing street gangs. Prior to crack, gangs like the Bloods and Crips in Los Angeles or the numerous crews in New York and Chicago were primarily social organizations focused on protecting neighborhood reputation and engaging in petty crime. Crack transformed them into sophisticated, hyper-violent, profit-driven paramilitary organizations. The crack market required constant, aggressive defense of territory.
Since the sales were high frequency and involved thousands of low-value transactions, the retail spots, the street corners, the front porches, the crack houses, were extremely valuable. This economic imperative led to the war for territory, or turf wars, that defined the crack era. The enforcer role. Gangs became the internal security and defense mechanism for the kingpins. Their primary function was to protect the retail spots from rival gangs, intimidate non-compliant neighbors, and enforce the kingpins' economic rules through brutal, summary violence. Weaponry escalation. The unprecedented cash flow from crack allowed gangs to finance an immediate and devastating upgrade in their arsenal. The simple handguns and zip guns of previous eras were replaced by powerful military-grade semi-automatic weapons. The escalating cycle of violence forced every gang to arm themselves more heavily than the last, leading to a massive increase in gun-related deaths. Geographic expansion. The promise of crack profits drove the LA's Bloods and Crips to franchise their operations. Members traveled to smaller cities across the South and Midwest, places like Kansas City, Seattle, and St. Louis, to establish new crack markets and recruitment centers, exporting both the drug and the specific brand of hyperviolence associated with the LA gang culture. The violence was not random, it was market rational. It was the predictable result of unregulated capitalism thriving in an environment of complete social and legal neglect. The homicide rate in many inner cities skyrocketed, transforming public space into a battlefield and creating a pervasive sense of terror that further isolated communities. Despite the immense wealth accumulated by the top kingpins, their reign was often tragically brief. The very structure of the crack trade ensured a high turnover rate among its leadership. 1. Internal violence. The decentralized nature of the trade meant that lieutenants and subordinates constantly sought to usurp the boss, leading to frequent assassinations and power struggles. Trust was a liability in the crack economy. 2. Law enforcement focus. The visible opulence and blatant violence of the kingpins made them obvious targets for federal and local law enforcement. Task forces were specifically created to dismantle these high-profile organizations using RICO statutes and increasingly sophisticated surveillance methods. 3. Betrayal and sentencing. Captured kingpins often faced mandatory minimum sentences of unprecedented length, decades or even life in prison. Facing such bleak futures, many cooperated with authorities, leading to the rapid collapse of their organizations and the imprisonment of countless subordinates. Thus, the kingpins' reign was a double-edged sword. They achieved immediate spectacular wealth, but their business model was predicated on an environment of extreme instability that guaranteed their eventual downfall, either by bullet or by prison sentence. The war for territory, fought on the streets over the right to sell a $5 rock, had an incalculable human cost that went beyond the body count. The constant, ambient violence of the crack years led to post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and chronic stress in entire neighborhoods. Children grew up familiar with the sounds of gunfire and learned survival tactics based on avoiding specific streets and maintaining silence about what they saw. This environment of terror further eroded trust in institutions, including the police, who were often perceived as an occupying force rather than protectors. The highly visible violence perpetrated by the kingpins and their gangs provided the final, necessary piece of the political puzzle: justification for punitive policy. The shocking imagery of young, wealthy, violent drug lords and the terrifying statistics of the soaring homicide rate allowed politicians to frame the crisis not as an economic failure requiring investment, but as a military problem requiring eradication. The kingpin's reign therefore served as the ultimate political prop for the sweeping, racially disproportionate legislation that would define the American criminal justice system for the next generation. The immediate, localized violence created by the crack trade was translated into national policy that ensured mass incarceration.
The public narrative of the crack epidemic was largely dominated by the sensationalized figures of the male street kingpin and the male turf warrior. Yet women were the invisible engine that often powered the retail drug trade and the most devastating casualties of the crisis. Their involvement was not monolithic. It ranged from being primary distributors to being victims of exploitation, driven by the same economic desperation that fueled their male counterparts. The hypercapitalism of the crack market created new, albeit dangerous roles for women in areas where legitimate employment had vanished. The runner and lookout. Many women, often young and disposable, served as runners, transporting crack rocks between the cooking site, the stash house, and the street dealers, thus reducing the male dealer's risk of being caught with large quantities. Others worked as lookouts, warning distributors of approaching police. These were low-pay, high-risk positions that leveraged women's relative invisibility in the early stages of the crisis before police adapted to their roles. The crack house operator. Women frequently managed the operational logistics of the crack house, overseeing the conversion process, packaging the final product, and managing the intake of money. Their domestic skills were warped into criminal efficiency, providing the organizational stability that undergirded the chaotic street sales. Survival sex and the vicious cycle. Crucially, a vast number of women, driven by the intensity of their own addiction and the drug's rapid consumption cycle, engaged in survival sex, prostitution, to finance their habit. The $5 rock meant that a woman could sell her body for a minimal price just to secure the next high. This practice exposed them to high rates of violence, infectious diseases, including HIV/AIDS, which accelerated in tandem with the crack crisis, and relentless dehumanization. The short, intense high, followed by an immediate crash, ensured that the cycle was continuous and inescapable. Unlike men, whose crisis was often framed through violence and enterprise, the female crack user's story was overwhelmingly one of exploitation, sexual violence, and deep personal shame. They were exploited by dealers for sex and labor, and then condemned by society for their moral failures. No single issue during the crack epidemic generated more public fury, media frenzy, and political reaction than the perception of the pregnant woman using crack. This image struck at the heart of America's deepest societal anxieties about race, class, and the sanctity of motherhood. The crisis became instantly personified by the term crack baby, as explored in the previous section, and the central villain became the crack mother. The media construction. Media reports in the late 1980s presented a lurid, exaggerated image of the crack-addicted mother as a reckless, monstrous figure who willingly sacrificed her unborn child for a transient high. This portrayal was heavily racialized, disproportionately focusing on Black women and ignoring the broader demographic reality of addiction. The narrative suggested a profound moral depravity, a willful abdication of the most fundamental biological and social duty, protecting one's child. The loss of empathy. This framing effectively stripped the addicted woman of her status as a patient deserving of treatment, recasting her instead as a criminal deserving of punishment. The complex reality that addiction is a disease and that many women struggled with severe mental health issues, poverty, and violence was completely erased. The societal reaction was one of pure, unadulterated condemnation. The extreme public fear generated by the crack mother narrative led directly to a series of severe, discriminatory policy and criminal justice responses aimed specifically at controlling and punishing poor women. A. Selective prosecution. In states across the nation, particularly in the South and Midwest, prosecutors began using existing child abuse, child neglect, and even drug trafficking laws to pursue criminal charges against mothers who used crack cocaine while pregnant. Felony charges. Women were arrested immediately after giving birth, often while still in the hospital. Charges ranged from distributing drugs to a minor, the umbilical cord being the conduit, to felony child abuse. This was a radical shift in law enforcement, as no similar criminal prosecution campaign had ever targeted mothers who struggled with other addictive substances, such as alcohol or prescription opioids. Racial disparity. Studies later revealed a staggering racial bias in these prosecutions. While white middle-class women were offered private treatment for drug use during pregnancy, poor minority women were overwhelmingly arrested and incarcerated. A 1990 report found that Black women were up to 10 times more likely than white women to be reported to social services for substance use during pregnancy, even when rates of use were comparable. The hospital setting, traditionally a place of care and confidentiality, became a site of criminal surveillance. Hospitals in some jurisdictions implemented mandatory drug testing for pregnant women or new mothers they suspected of substance use. Positive results were often immediately reported to law enforcement or child protective services, violating the women's medical privacy and establishing a hostile, punitive relationship between health providers and patients. Fearing arrest or the loss of their children, many pregnant women avoided prenatal care entirely, ironically leading to worse health outcomes for both themselves and their babies. While the sentencing disparity for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, the 100-to-1 ratio, is primarily associated with male drug dealers, its effects rippled powerfully through the female population. Many women whose involvement in the drug trade was minor, acting as mules, packaging, or simply possessing a small amount for personal use, were swept up by mandatory minimum sentencing laws.
Since the penalties for crack were so much harsher than for powder, minor offenses could result in sentences of 5, 10, or even 20 years. This ensured that, even for nonviolent roles, thousands of women were removed from their homes and families for extended periods, further destabilizing the kinship networks that were struggling to raise their children. The criminalization of the crack mother narrative became a potent engine of mass incarceration for women of color. The crack mother remains one of the most persistent and damaging stereotypes in American social history. It served to concentrate national outrage on individual moral failure, effectively diverting attention from the structural failures that created the crisis: the lack of jobs, the disinvestment in inner cities, and the absence of accessible, affordable drug treatment. The cruel irony is that, as the epidemic raged, policy emphasized prisons over prenatal care and punishment over public health. The women who most desperately needed comprehensive medical and social support, including intensive addiction treatment, job training, and mental health services, were instead offered the state's most punitive resource, the prison cell. The lasting legacy is twofold. First, the institutional trauma inflicted on a generation of children raised in the foster care system or by overburdened relatives, and second, the codification of a criminal justice system that views poor women struggling with addiction not as human beings in crisis, but as fundamentally dangerous criminals, a view that continues to color the response to subsequent drug epidemics, albeit with varying racial focus. The explosive visibility of the crack cocaine epidemic, the soaring inner-city homicide rates, the dramatic media portrayals of the crack mother, and the palpable public fear created an urgent, overwhelming demand for political action. By the mid-1980s, the crisis was no longer viewed as a public health emergency requiring treatment and social investment. It was an existential threat to American order that demanded a punitive, military-style response. This political climate, fueled by moral panic, led to one of the most consequential legislative shifts in modern American history: the introduction and widespread adoption of mandatory minimum sentencing laws. These laws were designed to strip federal judges of their discretion, forcing them to impose predetermined, lengthy prison sentences for drug offenses, regardless of mitigating factors, the defendant's specific role, or their history. The core philosophy was simple: deterrent through raw, uncompromising punishment. The crowning and most infamous piece of this legislative era was the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. This monumental bill, passed with overwhelming bipartisan support during the height of the media frenzy, enshrined into federal law a radical sentencing disparity that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the American criminal justice system. The most devastating feature of the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act was the establishment of a 100-to-1 sentencing ratio between crack cocaine and powdered cocaine. This ratio meant that a defendant possessing just 5 grams of crack cocaine, roughly the weight of 2 sugar packets, faced the same mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in federal prison as a defendant possessing 500 grams of powdered cocaine. To trigger the mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years, a person only needed to possess 50 grams of crack, compared to 5,000 grams, 5 kilograms, of powder. 5 grams crack, 5 years minimum sentence. 500 grams powder, 5 years minimum sentence. The ratio was never based on scientific or pharmacological evidence. Chemically and pharmacologically, crack cocaine and powdered cocaine are essentially the same substance. Crack is simply the base form, more suitable for smoking. While crack delivers a more intense, immediate high, which arguably contributes to faster addiction and more desperate consumption, the 100-to-1 ratio was not derived from any rigorous analysis of potency or harm. The congressional debates lacked scientific rigor. Instead, the ratio was a response to the vivid, terrifying images of the inner-city street violence and rapid decay associated with crack, images that were heavily racialized. Powdered cocaine, the drug of choice for affluent, predominantly white users, was associated with private health issues. Crack cocaine, the drug of the poor and predominantly black urban communities, was associated with public disorder and violence. The 100-to-1 ratio legally codified this social and racial distinction, ensuring that the penalties fell hardest on the most marginalized. The predictable and disastrous result of the 100-to-1 ratio was an explosion of racial disparity in the federal prison system. The targets: powder cocaine was handled by large-scale, often organized crime syndicates operating across racial lines, but its users were generally white and upper-middle class. Crack cocaine was retailed by young, minority individuals in the urban core. Federal law enforcement, driven by political pressure to show results against the scourge of crack, focused almost exclusively on street-level crack arrests in inner cities. The outcome? An overwhelming majority, historically over 80%, of those charged and sentenced under the crack mandatory minimums were African American, while a majority of those charged under the powder cocaine laws were white. The law effectively transformed racial inequality into a statistical certainty. Minor participants in the crack trade, lookouts, runners, and low-level sellers received sentences far longer than major powder cocaine distributors. The courtroom became the final arbiter of this inequality. Mandatory minimums eliminated the judge's ability to consider the context of systemic poverty, lack of opportunity, or the defendant's personal struggle with addiction. The law was deaf to the human story. The introduction of mandatory minimums, particularly the crack powder disparity, served as the primary engine for the American phenomena of mass incarceration in the late 19th century.
Prior to the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts, the U.S. prison population had been relatively stable. The new laws triggered an exponential, unprecedented growth in the number of federal and state prisoners. Drug offenses, fueled by crack arrests, became the single greatest driver of this expansion. The U.S. transitioned from having one of the lowest incarceration rates in the developed world to having the highest. The loss of community. The incarceration surge did more than fill prisons. It destabilized entire communities. Removing thousands of young men and, increasingly, women from specific neighborhoods created a severe depletion of social capital. Families were fractured, children grew up without fathers or mothers, and the vicious cycle of poverty and criminality was passed down a generation. The government's solution created a new, prolonged form of social collapse. Cost and priority. The astronomical cost of building and maintaining this expansive prison system diverted billions of dollars away from the social programs, schools, and infrastructure investment that could have addressed the root causes of the crack epidemic. The political choice was clear: spend on punishment, not on prevention or rehabilitation. IV. Collateral consequences and the permanence of punishment. The crisis in the courtroom extended far beyond the prison gates. Mandatory minimums created a web of what are known as collateral consequences, long-term punishments that persist long after a sentence is served. Disenfranchisement. Felony convictions, particularly for drug offenses, resulted in the permanent or temporary loss of voting rights for millions of individuals, disproportionately affecting the African American community and altering the political landscape. The job market and housing.
A felony conviction made it nearly impossible for former inmates to obtain legitimate employment or housing, driving them back into the underground economy and ensuring the continuation of the cycle they were supposed to have been punished for breaking. Exclusion from welfare. The 1996 Welfare Reform Act imposed a lifetime ban on federal welfare benefits, TANF, and food stamps for anyone with a drug felony conviction, further deepening the poverty and desperation of the families struggling in the wake of the crisis. The judiciary, the supposed bastion of blind justice, was transformed into an assembly line for mass punishment. The laws created in the panic of the crack epidemic ensured that the initial social devastation was compounded by a government response that was deliberately and systematically unequal, securing the crisis's toxic legacy for decades to come. The crack cocaine epidemic, a profound social and economic catastrophe, became a spectacular national drama thanks to the relentless machinery of American journalism. In the mid to late 1980s, television news, glossy magazines, and major newspapers did not merely report on the crisis, they actively constructed it, forging a narrative of escalating terror that magnified public anxiety and served as the direct justification for the draconian political policies that followed. The media became the fear machine, turning complex social breakdown into simple, terrifying sound bites. The relationship between the media, the public, and policymakers was symbiotic and destructive. Politicians, eager to appear tough on crime, fed the media sensational stories and startling statistics. The media, driven by the need for ratings and circulation, amplified these stories, and the terrified public, consuming this amplified coverage, demanded ever harsher political responses. This feedback loop ensured that rational debate about public health and systemic poverty was drowned out by a chorus of moral indignation. The most crucial element in this narrative construction was the pervasive use of racial bias and sensationalism. The invention of the crack baby and the subhuman user. As previously noted, the most damaging narrative generated by the media was the invention of the crack baby. News outlets and high-profile feature writers, seizing on preliminary and often speculative scientific studies, began publishing stories claiming that children exposed to crack in utero were irreparably damaged, doomed to a life of violence, mental illness, and learning disabilities. Sensational language. Terms like biological underclass, doomed generation, and permanent brain damage became common vernacular. A famous 1989 feature in U.S. News & World Report was titled "The Epidemic's Kids," branding an entire generation with a catastrophic, unproven diagnosis. The power of imagery. The crack baby narrative provided a visually compelling, emotionally devastating image, the innocent victim permanently damaged by the mother's moral failure. This image successfully shifted the focus of the crisis away from systemic issues, poverty, disinvestment, and placed it squarely on the individual pathology of the addicted, overwhelmingly minority mother, the crack mother. This allowed the public to feel justified in abandoning empathy for punitive action. Scientific exaggeration. News reports consistently failed to convey the nuances of the early studies, many of which concluded that poverty, stress, lack of prenatal care, and co-use of alcohol and tobacco were far more damaging than crack exposure alone. The complex reality was rejected in favor of the clean, frightening narrative of drug-induced biological doom. By defining the users as subhuman and the victims as damaged beyond repair, the media created a climate where severe social engineering, mass incarceration, seemed not just acceptable but necessary for the protection of society. The starkest manifestation of the fear machine was its differential coverage of the two forms of cocaine. Glamour versus grime. Throughout the 1970s, powder cocaine use, associated with Hollywood and Wall Street, largely white demographics, was frequently portrayed with a veneer of edgy sophistication. It was a vice of the rich, often treated as a minor health issue or a minor celebrity scandal. The swift shift to scourge. Once crack, the cheaper smokable form, took hold in poor, predominantly black and Hispanic urban centers, the narrative shifted instantly to one of scourge, plague, and urban terror. The media rarely investigated the deep economic desperation that made the $5 rock so accessible and appealing. Instead, they focused overwhelmingly on the resulting crime and violence. Visual reinforcement. News broadcasts heavily featured images of police raids in dilapidated, crowded public housing projects, showing young, non-white defendants being arrested and paraded before the cameras. This continuous visual linkage between crack, poverty, and minority communities cemented in the public consciousness the idea that crack was fundamentally a black problem, justifying the racially disparate application of the law. This selective focus laid the cognitive groundwork for the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity. The public was conditioned to believe that crack was chemically and socially far more dangerous drug than powder cocaine, thus accepting the massive difference in penalty as rational rather than discriminatory. The fear regime provided the essential political cover for the most punitive federal response. 1. Creating the urgency. News reports filled with escalating crime statistics, often exaggerated or misinterpreted, created a powerful sense of national emergency. Politicians, fearing being labeled soft on crime, felt immense pressure to act immediately, bypassing the slow process of thoughtful, long-term policy development. 2. The case of Len Bias. A defining moment was the tragic 1986 death of Len Bias, a promising white college basketball star who died from a cocaine overdose. Although Bias used powdered cocaine, the sensationalized media coverage of his death was immediately linked to the nascent crack crisis. This provided the emotional catalyst needed for the rapid passage of the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act. The death of a single high-profile white athlete was used to justify legislation that disproportionately targeted thousands of poor minority citizens. 3. Media as lobbyist. Network news and major print media effectively became the most powerful lobbying force for stricter drug laws. By consistently prioritizing stories of violence and moral collapse over stories of addiction and poverty, they set the agenda for Congress. Lawmakers, particularly in the run-up to the 1988 presidential election, raced to outdo each other with punitive proposals, leading to the institutionalization of mandatory minimums.
The media's role in the crack epidemic represents one of the most significant failures of American journalism in the 20th century. By prioritizing sensation over accuracy and crime over context, the fear machine achieved several disastrous long-term consequences. Normalized inequality. It normalized and legitimized the concept that drug addiction was a moral failing in poor communities that required caging, but a treatable disease in affluent communities. Diverted resources. The public's focus on the terrifying symptoms, violence, and crime ensured that political capital and financial resources were channeled almost entirely into policing, prisons, and interdiction, starving the critical areas of job creation, mental health care, and addiction treatment that could have stemmed the crisis. Lasting stigma. The deeply ingrained stigma of the crack baby and the crack mother persisted for decades, long after the scientific community had discredited the original claims, casting a shadow over a generation of children and their families. The legacy of the fear machine is clear. It provided the sensational, racially skewed imagery and narrative urgency necessary to usher in the era of mass incarceration, transforming a preventable public health crisis into a deliberate, punitive war waged on America's most vulnerable citizens. The term war on drugs was first coined by President Richard Nixon in 1971. But by the mid-1980s, the phrase was aggressively resurrected by the Reagan administration and transformed from a political slogan into a massive, resource-intensive federal mandate. The crack cocaine epidemic provided the perfect terrifying enemy needed to galvanize public support for an unprecedented shift in domestic policy and spending. President Ronald Reagan and First Lady Nancy Reagan seized the moment, elevating drug abuse from a chronic social problem to a catastrophic national emergency that threatened the very fabric of American life.
The First Lady's famous Just Say No campaign symbolized the administration's strategy, a moral and personal appeal that deflected attention from the complex socio-economic roots of the crisis and focused exclusively on the individual's choice and the moral failing of the user. This rhetoric served a crucial political purpose. It framed the crisis as a failure of morality rather than a failure of policy. By simplifying the crisis, the administration could justify a solution that was overwhelmingly punitive and martial in nature, rather than investing in costly social programs or addressing the decades of systemic poverty and disinvestment in urban areas. The political solution was to declare war on the drug, which in practice meant declaring war on the users and distributors who were predominantly poor and minority citizens. The rhetorical war was quickly backed by legislative muscle, fundamentally reshaping the federal government's role in local law enforcement and criminal justice. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 passed in a panicked bipartisan frenzy following the media storm surrounding the crack crisis, was the legislative centerpiece. As previously detailed, it established the catastrophic 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine, ensuring a massive surge in the federal incarceration of minorities. The 1988 Anti-Drug Abuse Act doubled down on this punitive approach. It further expanded mandatory minimum sentences, creating a new position, the drug czar, to coordinate federal drug policy. And it introduced the death penalty for certain large-scale drug offenses. Crucially, the 1988 Act also imposed harsh penalties, including the loss of public housing eligibility and denial of federal benefits for drug users, extending the punishment beyond the prison sentence and deepening the cycle of poverty and recidivism. The war on drugs was overwhelmingly funded for enforcement and supply-side interdiction. Federal funds were channeled into police forces, border patrol, and international efforts to combat cartels. In contrast, funding for demand reduction, drug treatment, prevention programs, and long-term rehabilitation remained woefully inadequate. The message embedded in the budget was clear. America would solve the drug crisis by arresting and imprisoning its way out of it. This policy choice ensured that when users, especially those facing the intense compulsion of crack addiction, sought help, they found waiting lists and understaffed facilities, not immediate comprehensive care. The resources were placed behind the gun and the jail cell, not the counselor's office. One of the most enduring and controversial legacies of the escalating war on drugs was the militarization of local police departments. Federal policy and funding actively encouraged local law enforcement to adopt the gear, tactics, and mindset of a military fighting an insurgency. Federal legislation initiated programs that distributed military-grade equipment, intelligence, and training directly to local police. Programs like the Asset Forfeiture Program incentivized aggressive policing. This program allowed law enforcement to seize property, cash, cars, homes, suspected of being tied to drug crime, even if the owner was never formally charged or convicted. The seized assets were then kept by the police department that made the seizure, creating a massive, profit-driven motivation for intense drug enforcement. The crack crisis led to the proliferation of specialized, heavily armed tactical units, most notably SWAT teams, in cities across the country. These units, initially designed for extreme situations like hostage rescues, began to be deployed routinely for serving low-level drug warrants, particularly no-knock raids on crack houses. Tactical shift, the mindset shifted from community policing, protecting and serving, to paramilitary policing, searching and seizing. Officers were trained to view drug-infested neighborhoods as occupied territories and residents as potential hostiles. The consequences: the increased use of aggressive, unannounced raids led to a surge in violent confrontations, unintended civilian injuries, and a profound breakdown in trust between police and the communities they patrolled. This aggressive enforcement, often documented on local news, reinforced the political narrative that the inner city was under siege, justifying the military posture. When President George H.W. Bush took office in 1989, the strategy did not pivot. Instead, the administration solidified the punitive approach, arguing that the heavy hand of the state was finally making progress against the epidemic. Bush famously delivered a televised address holding up a bag of crack cocaine, claiming it had been seized just across the street from the White House. This theatrical moment, later revealed to be based on an elaborate federal sting operation, perfectly encapsulated the administration's reliance on symbolism and fear to drive policy. Under both Reagan and Bush, the federal government successfully externalized the problem. The root cause was not systemic failure in America, but illegal drugs flowing in from outside, requiring militarized border defense, and moral failure within the individual, requiring imprisonment. The escalation of the war on drugs during the crack era established a precedent that persists to this day. The political rhetoric created a deeply entrenched bipartisan consensus that favored punitive measures, resulting in the following long-term outcomes. 1. Normalization of mass incarceration. The prison system became the primary mechanism for dealing with social problems, displacing mental health care, unemployment, and addiction treatment. 2. Erosion of rights. The urgency of the war led to a slow, steady erosion of civil liberties, including the expansion of police surveillance and search powers. 3. The racial scar. The militarized focus on crack ensured that the war on drugs became, in effect, a war on minority communities, leaving behind a profound legacy of racial resentment, damaged trust, and systemic inequality that continues to define the American criminal justice landscape. The war on drugs, catalyzed by the crack crisis, was won on the political stage and in the appropriations committees, but it was lost on the streets and in the countless homes fractured by a policy that chose punishment over compassion.
The domestic drug crisis that culminated in the crack epidemic was tragically intertwined with the complex, often clandestine geopolitical conflicts of the Cold War. To understand the explosive claims regarding the CIA and the Contras, one must first appreciate the political climate of the 1980s. The Reagan administration was intensely focused on combating the spread of communism in Central America, particularly in Nicaragua, where the socialist Sandinista government had overthrown the U.S.-backed Somoza regime. In response, the U.S. began secretly supporting a counter-revolutionary force known as the Contras, short for Contra-Revolucionarios. When Congress, via the Boland Amendments of 1982 to 1984, restricted federal funding to the Contras, the administration and its agents sought alternative, often illicit means to finance the insurgency. It is this desperate shadow war for funding that forms the core of the controversy. The Contras needed cash, and the massive, unregulated flow of cocaine from South America to the U.S. offered an irresistible financial opportunity. The accusation, persistent and explosive, was that various Contra factions and their associates leveraged their political protection and military supply lines to move massive quantities of cocaine into the United States, thereby fueling the very drug crisis that the U.S. government was simultaneously declaring a war on drugs. The controversy first achieved widespread national attention in 1996, a decade after the height of the crack epidemic, through a powerful investigative series titled Dark Alliance, published by journalist Gary Webb in the San Jose Mercury News. Webb's investigation claimed to demonstrate a direct link between the crack explosion in south-central Los Angeles and Contra drug trafficking. His thesis was revolutionary and inflammatory. Contra-affiliated drug smugglers, primarily Nicaraguan exiles, opened up the first high-volume drug pipeline into the black neighborhoods of L.A. Their cocaine, Webb argued, was sold to key L.A. distributors like Freeway Rick Ross, who then converted it into the highly profitable crack rocks. The profits from these sales, in turn, were funneled back to the Contras to buy weapons.
Webb's central, most provocative charge was that the CIA was aware of this trafficking and tacitly allowed it to happen in order to protect its larger anti-communist objectives. In essence, the U.S. government, through negligence or willful blindness, had traded drugs for arms, sacrificing American urban communities in the process. The Dark Alliance series struck a chord in the inner cities, where residents had long suspected complicity in the sudden, destructive arrival of crack. The articles tapped into a deep vein of distrust toward government authority and offered a powerful, systemic explanation for a crisis that had predominantly been blamed on individual moral failure. The initial shockwave of Webb's allegations was immense, but it was quickly followed by a brutal and effective backlash from major national media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. These papers accused Webb of making hyperbolic claims, using unreliable sources, and failing to provide conclusive evidence of direct high-level CIA involvement. They acknowledged the existence of Contra-affiliated traffickers, but argued that the sheer scale of the international cocaine trade meant that the Contras' contribution was minor and certainly not the sole cause of the crack epidemic. The CIA was forced to respond to the public outcry. They initiated an unprecedented internal investigation led by Inspector General Frederick Hitz, eventually publishing a 2-volume report known as the Hitz Report. No agency-wide conspiracy. The CIA concluded that it did not conspire to flood U.S. streets with crack cocaine to fund the Contras. They found no evidence that any high-ranking official authorized or knew about the trafficking in advance. Knowledge of trafficking. Crucially, however, the CIA admitted that it knew about allegations of drug trafficking involving Contra leaders and supporters. The report stated that dozens of people affiliated with the Contra movement were also involved in drug smuggling into the U.S., and that the agency failed to aggressively investigate or report these activities. Relationship compromise. The report acknowledged that the CIA maintained relationships with individuals and groups despite knowing of their criminal behavior, prioritizing the goal of overthrowing the Sandinistas over enforcing U.S. drug laws. It confirmed that the CIA was often concerned with protecting its relationships with Contra leaders rather than pursuing drug interdiction. The Hitz report validated the most disturbing component of Webb's story, that the U.S. intelligence community had, at best, tolerated cocaine trafficking by its allies. It confirmed a profound hypocrisy at the heart of the war on drugs, where foreign policy goals were given precedence over domestic public health and law enforcement. Regardless of the precise quantity of cocaine brought in by Contra-affiliated groups, the controversy provides a vital lens through which to view the domestic crack crisis. First, supply diversification. The Contra network, even if it only supplied a fraction of the total U.S. cocaine market, was active in the early to mid-1980s, precisely when the U.S. market was saturated and distributors were looking for new ways to move product. Any additional supply in this volatile environment contributed to the price decline that made crack financially feasible. 2. Moral hypocrisy. The allegations highlighted the systemic double standard in the war on drugs. At the same time the federal government was using mandatory minimums and militarized police to jail thousands of poor minority citizens for street-level possession, it was simultaneously, or at least its agents were, turning a blind eye to massive international drug trafficking when it served a political purpose. This dual reality confirmed the deep cynicism felt by those in the inner cities regarding the true aims of the war on drugs. 3. Fueling distrust. The CIA's ultimate admission of complicity, however qualified, served to solidify long-held suspicions within the black community that the crisis was deliberately engineered or at least sanctioned by a system fundamentally hostile to their well-being. This distrust remains a significant barrier to effective community police relations and public health initiatives. Gary Webb's career was destroyed by the mainstream media's initial repudiation of his work, and he tragically died by suicide in 2004.
However, the subsequent findings of the CIA's own Inspector General effectively vindicated the core suspicion that the U.S. government's obsessive focus on communism led it to overlook and thereby enable activities that directly exacerbated the domestic drug crisis.
The controversy stands as a stark testament to the idea that the crack epidemic was not just a domestic tragedy of addiction and poverty, but a crisis shaped by global politics, covert operations, and the cynical prioritization of foreign policy objectives over the safety and well-being of America's own marginalized communities. The question of whether the CIA caused the crack epidemic is less important than the proven reality that the U.S. system was structurally willing to tolerate the flow of the poison in pursuit of its geopolitical ends. As the political machine declared a war on drugs, the battle was fought, often literally, on the streets of America's inner cities. Local law enforcement officers found themselves transformed overnight from community servants into the thin blue line against what was perceived as a societal invasion. The challenge they faced was unprecedented. They were expected to stem a tidal wave of drug supply, suppress an explosion of turf war violence, and contain a public health crisis, all while operating in communities that were economically decimated and deeply skeptical of their authority. The reality of the front line was chaotic and terrifying. The hyperviolence of the crack trade, fueled by immense profits and the low-cost accessibility of firearms, meant that every routine traffic stop or drug raid carried a high risk of lethal confrontation. Officers constantly encountered automatic weapons, booby-trapped drug houses, and a desperate population willing to commit violence to protect their economic lifeline, the $5 crack rock. This environment led to inevitable consequences: a necessary but often heavy-handed tactical response, a breakdown in community relations, and tragically, the corruption of some who swore to uphold the law. The primary challenge faced by law enforcement was one of scale and resource disparity. The shift toward mandatory minimum sentencing, combined with the visible nature of crack sales, led to an avalanche of arrests. Local police were incredibly efficient at apprehending low-level dealers, lookouts, and users, the easiest targets. However, this flooded the local criminal justice system. Jails overflowed, court dockets became unmanageable, and prosecutors were forced to triage cases, often prioritizing volume over justice. The police became an assembly line for the prison system. Yet the actual rate of drug use and violence often continued unabated, demonstrating the futility of an enforcement-only strategy. Federal funding streams, as explored in the previous section, ensured that local police departments received military-grade equipment, often via the 1033 program, which transferred surplus military gear. While justified as necessary to confront heavily armed gangs, this militarization had severe unintended consequences. The introduction of SWAT teams for routine drug warrants created an adversarial dynamic. A sudden, violent, no-knock raid on a suspected crack house, even one based on poor intelligence, terrified law-abiding residents and cemented the perception of the police as an occupying army rather than a protecting force. This destroyed the essential ingredient for effective policing: community trust and cooperation. The greatest internal threat to the thin blue line was the sheer vulgar profitability of the crack trade. The immense quantities of cash, jewelry, and high-value drugs constantly changing hands offered a temptation that few other criminal enterprises could match, leading to widespread and highly corrosive instances of police corruption. The most common form of corruption involved the simple theft of cash and drugs seized during raids. A small-time dealer might carry a few $1,000s and several ounces of crack. A dedicated police unit conducting multiple raids could quickly accumulate hundreds of thousands of dollars in illicit profits. Cases emerged across the country, from New York to Los Angeles, where officers were caught skimming money from drug seizures or replacing high-grade cocaine with cheaper substitutes before booking the evidence. This undermined the integrity of countless prosecutions, as defense attorneys could rightly cast doubt on the chain of custody for evidence. More disturbingly, some rogue officers or specialized anti-gang units became integrated into the drug economy itself. Selling seized drugs. Officers would seize drugs, not book them as evidence, and then resell them to other criminal organizations or independent dealers. This was particularly insidious because the police themselves became purveyors of the same product they were sworn to eradicate, often ensuring a more dangerous and chaotic supply chain. Protection rackets. Some officers formed protection rackets, shaking down dealers for cash in exchange for a blind eye, or worse, providing intelligence on rival gangs or upcoming police operations. The Rampart scandal, the nadir of this type of corruption, was later exposed in the infamous Rampart scandal in the late 1990s in Los Angeles, though its roots lay squarely in the aggressive anti-gang, anti-crack policing tactics of the 1980s. Officers in the U.S. LAPD Ranch, Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums unit were involved in unprovoked shootings, planting false evidence, fabricating reports, and stealing drugs, leading to the wrongful overturning of numerous criminal convictions. This internal rot destroyed the moral high ground of the war on drugs. The discovery that the very people assigned to protect the community were profiting from its destruction deepened the cynicism and despair of citizens already victimized by economic forces. The pressure to achieve high-profile arrests and show results against the kingpins led to the widespread use of confidential informants. The informant economy, while tactically necessary, created its own ethical quagmire. Officers often granted CIs vast latitude, overlooking their crimes, including drug use or low-level trafficking, in exchange for intelligence on bigger targets. This created a situation where the state was essentially sponsoring criminal activity, using one set of criminals to apprehend another. Furthermore, the intense focus on volume arrests and large busts meant that lower-level users, who might have benefited from treatment, were prioritized for incarceration, while major wholesale distributors often escaped scrutiny through successful plea bargaining or cooperation with federal agents. The pursuit of the big bust often sacrificed community safety and fairness at the retail level. The experience of the crack epidemic fundamentally altered the relationship between American inner cities and the police. Law enforcement, operating under a mandate of war and armed with military resources and punitive laws, inflicted immense structural damage. 1. Mass incarceration. They were the primary executors of the 100-to-1 disparity, leading to the mass separation of families. 2. Community trauma. Their militarized tactics contributed to the atmosphere of fear and the psychological trauma experienced by residents. 3. Institutionalized corruption. Instances of corruption, amplified by the immense financial lure of crack, solidified the perception that the police were not allies, but simply another, more powerful, predatory force in the neighborhood. For the many honest, dedicated officers who bravely faced down the violence of the crack era, the challenge was immense, and the personal toll was high. Yet the actions of the corrupt few, enabled by the systemic pressures of the war on drugs, ensured that the legacy of law enforcement from this period is one of profound and lasting distrust, a wound that continues to fester in contemporary American society.
By the mid-1990s, the crack cocaine epidemic, as a national emergency characterized by spiraling urban violence, began to subside. The market stabilized, use leveled off, and the dramatic nightly headlines faded. Yet the crisis did not disappear. It simply metastasized, transforming from an acute national plague into a chronic social condition.
The true devastation of the crack era was not the addiction itself, which declined, but the permanent, systemic damage inflicted upon communities by the convergence of the drug and the punitive governmental response. This destruction created a lost generation, not just of users and dealers, but of children, families, and neighborhoods whose trajectories were fundamentally warped by the experience. The long-term trauma manifested in three interlocking crises: the institutionalization of concentrated poverty, the inheritance of generational trauma, and the enduring public health fallout. The crack epidemic did not cause poverty, but it cemented and deepened its concentration in inner cities, ensuring that economic despair became a permanent feature of the landscape. The crisis acted as a massive vacuum cleaner, sucking economic capital out of already poor communities. The constant, frantic need to finance crack addiction meant that every dollar entering the neighborhood, whether through meager wages, welfare checks, or illegal profits, was immediately diverted to purchasing the drug. This rapid money outflow prevented any meaningful savings, investment in local businesses, or wealth accumulation. The community was left with no economic defense against collapse. More devastatingly, the crack epidemic destroyed human capital. The mass incarceration resulting from the 100-to-1 disparity removed 2 generations of working-age adults, fathers, mothers, and potential entrepreneurs from the job market and the home. These individuals returned years later with felony records, making them virtually unemployable in the legitimate economy, and creating a cycle of recidivism. The neighborhood lost its primary resources, its productive adults, its mentors, and its tax base. The epidemic and the subsequent policy response created profound housing instability. Thousands of families were evicted from public housing due to new one-strike and you're-out policies for drug-related activity, often displacing innocent family members along with the addicted or incarcerated relative. This perpetual churn ensured that stable, long-term residence, essential for neighborhood organization and school success, became a luxury few could afford, hardening the boundaries of concentrated poverty. The children who grew up during the height of the crack epidemic, the true lost generation, did not merely witness trauma, they inherited it, a phenomenon known as generational trauma. While the myth of the crack baby, prenatal, biological damage, was largely debunked, the reality of childhood trauma was undeniable. Children were raised in environments characterized by neglect, being left unattended for days while a parent binged, violence, witnessing drug-related turf wars, domestic abuse, and police raids, grief and loss, experiencing the sudden, dramatic removal of parents by incarceration or death. These experiences created high rates of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. Studies show that high ACE scores are linked to chronic stress, poor impulse control, difficulty in forming secure attachments, and higher rates of health problems later in life. This psychological damage became a social liability, manifesting as behavioral problems in schools and increased vulnerability to violence and substance abuse in adolescence. Even after the scientific debunking, the media-driven stigma of the crack baby clung to an entire cohort of children. Teachers, social workers, and even potential employers often viewed these children through a lens of predestined failure. This social expectation, or labeling, often became a self-fulfilling prophecy, undermining the children's confidence and limiting their access to opportunities, adding a layer of systemic psychological burden to their physical poverty. The crack epidemic's shadow extended deeply into the public health and safety infrastructure, creating consequences that endured for decades. The epidemic directly fueled the spread of the HIV/AIDS virus in urban areas. Crack use, particularly the immediate crash it caused, was closely linked to high-risk behaviors, including the rapid acceleration of survival sex, prostitution, and, less frequently than heroin, the sharing of needles, as some users injected a liquid form of the base. The economic desperation of users and the high turnover in sexual partners made the inner city a hotspot for the virus, compounding a public health disaster with a drug crisis. The exposure to chronic violence and trauma throughout the crack years left behind a deep-seated mental health crisis in affected communities. High rates of untreated PTSD, depression, and anxiety became normalized. The same governmental policies that arrested users also cut funding for community mental health clinics, leaving little infrastructure to treat the deep psychological wounds of the epidemic. The lack of treatment ensured that mental health issues became intertwined with poverty and addiction, continuing the cycle of social dysfunction. While homicide rates eventually declined, the cultural shift toward violence endured. The militarization of street gangs, the normalization of carrying heavy weaponry, and the economic lesson that violence pays did not immediately disappear. The children raised during the turf wars inherited a cultural context where disputes were settled through violence, contributing to ongoing, though less widespread, criminal activity long after the initial crisis peaked. The lost generation stands as a monument to America's failure to recognize and address social breakdown at its roots. The permanent damage, concentrated poverty, fractured families, and deep-seated trauma was not a byproduct of the drug alone, but the direct result of a policy response that preferred mass punishment over holistic investment. In the decades that followed, as the nation confronted the opioid epidemic, the racial and class dynamics were reversed. The new crisis was widely seen affecting white middle-class communities. Only then did the national narrative shift to emphasize treatment, compassion, and public health, a chilling echo that underscores the profound and enduring racial inequality embedded in the legacy of the crack cocaine crisis and the suffering of the generation it destroyed. The 100-to-1 sentencing disparity, the centerpiece of the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, was not merely a harsh law. It was a deeply ingrained symbol of systemic racial inequality in the American justice system. Born from political panic and media sensationalism, the law dictated that a person trafficking or possessing 5 grams of crack cocaine faced the same 5-year mandatory minimum sentence as a person dealing 500 grams of powder cocaine. By the early 1990s, the disastrous consequences of this ratio were statistically undeniable. Racial impact. While crack and powder cocaine were pharmacologically the same, the law was enforced almost exclusively against black defendants, who made up over 80% of those convicted of crack cocaine offenses in federal court, despite studies indicating that white and Hispanic individuals used crack cocaine as well. Mass incarceration. The disparity propelled the mass incarceration of African American men and women, separating families, decimating social capital, and transforming the legal system into the primary mechanism of racial control in post-civil rights America. The decades-long struggle to reform the 100-to-1 wall was a battle fought on legal, political, and moral grounds, uniting activists, legal experts, and eventually a growing number of bipartisan politicians who recognized the law as a historical injustice.
In the first decade following the Act's passage, the initial challenges to the 100-to-1 ratio were launched within the court system, primarily arguing that the disparity violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and constituted cruel and unusual punishment. Many federal judges, forced by mandatory minimums to impose excessively long sentences on low-level offenders, became vocal critics. They often expressed their moral opposition from the bench, lamenting their lack of discretion to apply sentences that were proportionate to the crime. They saw the human face of the law's failure, first-time nonviolent offenders receiving prison terms equivalent to those given to cartel bosses. However, legal challenges failed to overturn the law. The Supreme Court repeatedly upheld the constitutionality of the disparity, arguing that while the ratio was severe, it was the result of a political judgment by Congress concerning the perceived greater societal danger posed by crack. This judicial deference meant that the legal battle was effectively closed. The fight for fairness had to shift entirely to the legislative and political arenas. With the courts unwilling to act, a sustained, multi-front campaign was necessary. Activists, civil rights organizations, and legal think tanks began the arduous work of changing the public narrative and educating policymakers. Organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the Sentencing Project launched intensive data campaigns. They meticulously documented the racial outcomes of the 100-to-1 ratio, replacing the media's anecdotal fear with undeniable statistics. They demonstrated the stark contrast. A white defendant in the suburbs caught with enough powder cocaine to trigger no mandatory minimum might walk free, while a young black man in the city caught with a small amount of crack faced 5 to 10 years in federal prison. This data was critical in shifting the debate from an issue of drug fighting to one of sentencing equality. Perhaps the most important institutional voice arguing for reform was the U.S. Sentencing Commission, the independent body created by Congress to standardize federal sentencing guidelines. The USSC, having access to comprehensive data on federal convictions, repeatedly advised Congress that the 100-to-1 ratio was irrational and racially biased. In 1995, the USSC first recommended that Congress equate crack and powder penalties. Congress not only ignored the recommendation, but issued a rare rebuke to the Commission. The USSC reiterated its call for parity multiple times over the next decade, providing detailed reports that exposed the law's failure to deter drug use while fueling massive racial disparity in incarceration. It took over 20 years of unrelenting pressure, combined with the soaring financial costs of mass incarceration and a gradual realization by conservatives that the laws were ineffective, for Congress to finally act. The political environment began to shift in the late 2000s. The crack epidemic was no longer dominating headlines, and a new drug crisis, the opioid epidemic, was emerging, affecting largely white, rural, and suburban communities. This shift in demographics coincided with a new emphasis on treatment and public health over mandatory incarceration, creating political space to revisit the crack laws. The effort culminated in the passage of the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, which was signed into law by President Barack Obama. The FSA achieved the following: reduced the ratio. It reduced the 100-to-1 disparity to a ratio of 18-to-1. While still a disparity, this was a massive reduction, raising the amount of crack needed to trigger the 5-year mandatory minimum sentence from 5 grams to 28 grams. Eliminated the 5-year mandatory minimum for simple possession of crack cocaine, ensuring that mere users were not automatically subjected to the harshest federal penalties. The FSA was hailed as a significant, though imperfect, step towards justice. However, its effectiveness was initially limited because the law was not retroactive. thousands of individuals already incarcerated under the punitive 100-to-1 ratio remained behind bars. The final, crucial stage of the fight for fairness involved securing retroactive application of the 2010 reforms, allowing those convicted under the old discriminatory law to seek reduced sentences. This was finally achieved with the bipartisan passage of the First Step Act of 2018. This landmark legislation made the Fair Sentencing Act's crack cocaine provisions retroactive, allowing thousands of federal inmates to petition courts for a review and reduction of their sentences. Impact: by 2023, the First Step Act had resulted in the reduction of sentences for thousands of individuals, a majority of whom were Black, providing a measure of redress for those who had suffered the most extreme consequences of the 100-to-1 disparity. This included many who had already served over a decade in prison for low-level crack offenses.
The grand, devastating narrative of the crack cocaine epidemic is often told through statistics of violence, arrests, and legislative failures. Yet the true conclusion of the crisis, the quiet, ongoing victory, is found in the individual stories of survival and transformation. For every life lost to the epidemic, and for every life swallowed by the prison system, there are thousands of others who found an exit ramp from the self-destructive highway of addiction. The journey from the desperate cycle of the $5 rock to a stable, purposeful life represents an act of profound personal courage, requiring not just willpower, but a sudden, desperate alignment of internal readiness and external support. The story of recovery is fundamentally a story of redemption, where individuals, many of whom society had labeled as doomed or irredeemable, reclaimed their identities, rebuilt fractured families, and, most powerfully, returned to the communities they had once damaged to advocate for systemic change. These narratives stand as a testament against the punitive policies of the era, arguing that investment in the human spirit, not imprisonment, is the true path to community healing. Recovery from crack addiction rarely began with a gradual decision. It often started with a sudden, searing moment of clarity, a flash of realization at the absolute bottom of despair. This moment might be triggered by various traumatic events, all products of the crack lifestyle. The loss of a child. For many crack mothers and fathers, the intervention of social services and the irreversible loss of custody of a child served as the ultimate, non-negotiable bottom. The pain of separation became a greater force than the compulsion of the drug. The confrontation with death, a near-fatal overdose, a violent assault in a crack house, or waking up in a hospital or jail cell after a days-long binge, stripped bare of dignity and possessions. The sight of one's own reflection, a spectral echo of the person they once were, became the catalyst for change. The weight of incarceration. For those who hit bottom in prison, the sheer monotony and finality of a long sentence provided a forced sobriety and time for deep reflection. The opportunity to participate in prison-based addiction programs, however rare or underfunded, offered the structure necessary to break the cycle. These moments led to the realization that the initial euphoria of the drug had long been replaced by a desperate, anxious compulsion. The user was no longer seeking pleasure. They were simply avoiding the crushing pain of the crash. Breaking free required recognizing that the drug had become the master and the self the slave. The road to redemption involved more than just abstinence. It required a complete dismantling and rebuilding of the self, often achieved through structured, long-term programs. Successful recovery narratives highlight the importance of community and structure, often found in 12-step programs, faith-based organizations, or residential treatment centers. These environments provided the accountability, emotional support, and shared experience necessary to counter the isolation of addiction. In a safe, supportive space, individuals could finally articulate the systemic trauma, the poverty, the racism, the lack of opportunity that had originally paved the way for the drug's appeal, integrating their personal struggle into a broader social context. A crucial step in the healing process was reconciliation with family. For the formerly addicted parent, redemption was synonymous with regaining the trust of their children and the forgiveness of their own parents, the grandparents, who had often stepped in as primary caregivers. This was a slow, painful process, marked with constant relapse risks and setbacks. The act of recovery, therefore, became a communal effort, strengthening the very kinship networks that the epidemic had nearly dissolved. The recovering mother or father became a living testament to resilience, demonstrating to their children that generational curses could be broken. Re-entry into the legitimate workforce was often the hardest obstacle, a cruel systemic consequence of the punitive laws. Individuals returning from prison, even after achieving sobriety, faced the collateral consequences of felony convictions, job discrimination, denial of housing, and exclusion from federal aid. Redemption was often stalled by the very policies designed to punish. Stories of survival are filled with accounts of relentless door-knocking, accepting minimum wage jobs, and relying on community organizations willing to overlook a felony record. Their success was not just a personal victory, it was a powerful challenge to the efficacy of mass incarceration, proving that investment in human potential yields greater dividends than warehousing people in prisons. The deepest form of redemption was found when survivors transformed their painful experience into advocacy, returning to their communities not just as recovered citizens, but as agents of social change. The recovered addict was uniquely positioned to argue against the war on drugs philosophy. Speaking truth to power. Individuals like Susan Burton, who was repeatedly incarcerated due to her crack addiction, went on to found a New Way of Life Reentry project, providing housing and support for formerly incarcerated women. Her life story became a potent weapon against the system that had oppressed her, illustrating that housing, treatment, and opportunity were the keys to stopping recidivism. Mentorship and prevention. Many survivors became counselors, outreach workers, and mentors, deploying their hard-won experience to save the next generation. They could speak with an authenticity that no politician or professional social worker could match, understanding the specific language of despair, temptation, and the street economy. They became the living proof that recovery was not a myth. Policy reform. Recovered individuals played a crucial, often unseen role in the legislative fights, particularly the push for the First Step Act. By sharing their personal stories, detailing how the one-to-one disparity had unjustly lengthened their sentences for minor crimes, they humanized the statistics for policymakers, bridging the empathy gap necessary for bipartisan reform. These advocates understood that their sobriety was not a private matter, it was a public tool for dismantling the systemic barriers that continued to oppress their neighborhoods.
The stories of recovery and redemption are the counterbalance to the despair of the lost generation narrative. They challenge the foundational assumption of the crack era that some lives are disposable. They demonstrate that the immense cost of the epidemic was not just the money spent on drugs or prisons, but the staggering waste of human potential. The final, lasting legacy of those who survived the crack epidemic is a mandate for change, that society must shift its focus from what is wrong with this person, the punitive approach, to what happened to this person, the trauma-informed, health-based approach. Their survival proves that redemption is possible, but it requires that the institutions that once criminalized them must now commit to supporting their recovery. Their hope is the critical element needed to rebuild the communities that were fractured by the smoke and the ruin. The crack cocaine epidemic and the government's response to it represents a watershed moment in American domestic policy. The decisions made during those tumultuous years, the embrace of mandatory minimums, the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity, the militarization of policing, and the neglect of social investment did more than just fail to solve the crisis. They created a permanent destructive legacy of mass incarceration and racial inequality. The retrospective assessment of the crack years is not merely an academic exercise. It is a vital ethical duty,
offering essential, though often unheeded lessons for how America addresses subsequent public health emergencies. The ultimate failure of the crack response was its refusal to acknowledge the crisis as an interconnected issue of poverty, addiction, and historical trauma. Instead, it chose the expedient path of criminalization. The question for contemporary policymakers is whether the painful, demonstrably ineffective, and unjust policies of the 1980s were learned from, or merely adapted for a new demographic. The answer, chillingly, lies in the differing national response to the opioid epidemic. The key lessons that should have been absorbed from the crack era are stark and simple. Prevent addiction through investment in vulnerable communities. Admit that differentiated sentencing is racist. Despite the clarity of this historical record, the policy establishment struggled for decades to implement these lessons fully, leading to an initial period of stasis and eventually a differential application of compassion. The emergence and escalation of the opioid epidemic in the 2000s and 2010s provided a critical, painful benchmark for the nation's capacity to learn from its past. The contrast between the national response to the crack crisis and the opioid crisis starkly exposed the role of race and class in shaping American public policy. When the opioid crisis, fueled initially by the overprescription of pharmaceutical painkillers and later by heroin and synthetic fentanyl, began to decimate predominantly white suburban and rural communities, the national narrative underwent a dramatic and revealing shift. Crack. The media and politicians framed the crisis as a problem of urban chaos, crime, and moral decay, demanding swift, punitive action against the user-dealer. Opioids. The media and politicians reframed the crisis as a public health crisis, a disease, and an unfortunate tragedy, demanding compassion, treatment, and social support for the victim patient. This change in language was paramount. It moved the afflicted population from the realm of the criminal justice system to the domain of the healthcare system. This was the most significant lesson learned, but it was a lesson applied selectively. The policy response to the opioid crisis demonstrated a structural avoidance of the crack era's mistakes, but only for the new, mostly white demographic. Treatment over incarceration. Federal and state governments began aggressively funding medication-assisted treatment, establishing diversion programs, and promoting overdose reversal drugs, Narcan or naloxone. The concept of treatment courts, where addiction is treated as a health issue rather than a criminal one, became widespread. This was the antithesis of the just say no and mandatory prison approach of the 1980s. Harm reduction. Policies like needle exchanges, once fiercely resisted as enabling, became accepted public health tools to reduce the spread of HIV and hepatitis C, a concept that was almost unthinkable during the peak of the crack epidemic. Sentencing reform. Although general reform was slow, the punitive rhetoric of the 1980s did not fully reassert itself. Instead, policymakers focused on prosecuting the pharmaceutical companies and doctors who facilitated the crisis, shifting the blame from the individual user to the powerful suppliers, a framing never afforded to the victims of crack. While the opioid response demonstrated a newfound compassionate approach, the commitment to correcting the structural injustices of the crack era remained partial and hesitant. The persistence of the disparity. Despite the reform achieved by the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, reducing the ratio from 100-1 to 18-1, the disparity remains. The continued existence of any ratio, given the pharmacological identity of the two substances, is a symbolic and legal persistence of racial bias. This failure to achieve full one-to-one parity demonstrates a political unwillingness to fully acknowledge the historical wrong. The incarceration scar.
the structural damage caused by mass incarceration, the millions of disenfranchised citizens, the destruction of urban economic basis, and the generational trauma is a scar that decades of reform have only partially healed. Even with retroactivity, the time stolen from individuals and families cannot be repaid. The U.S. remains globally an outlier in its prison population, a direct, continuing legacy of the crack crisis. The policy retrospective on the crack cocaine epidemic reveals a painful truth. America learned how to treat addiction, but only when it affected its privileged citizens. The mistakes of the 1980s, the choice of the jail cell over the treatment bed, were not inevitable. They were deliberate political choices driven by race and fear. The legacy of the epidemic is not just the memory of the drug itself, but the institutionalization of the idea that justice could be sacrificed for the sake of political expediency. The ongoing push for full sentencing parity and comprehensive reinvestment in the communities targeted by the war on drugs remains the final, unfinished ethical and policy reckoning required to truly move beyond the most destructive domestic crisis of late 20th century America.